Very much for that introduction, and thank you guys for coming out today. I'm excited to be here giving this talk. So as was already mentioned, I'm going to be talking about higher order theories of consciousness and the phenomenology of belief. So let's go ahead and get started. So yesterday I spent some time talking about those philosophers who despair of our ever being able to understand consciousness in naturalistic or scientific terms. And so probably one of the best known persons of this kind is David Chalmers. Who thinks that, well, we just won't ever be able to get a grip scientifically on what consciousness is. It will always exceed our grasp. Now, there are those who think that the way the problem has been set up ultimately leads to us shooting ourselves in the foot, so to speak. So some people think that the way that the explanans has been identified is already set up the problem in such a way that you can't solve it. So if you think of consciousness as something that is just a simple, unanalyzable property, then of course it's going to appear to you that you can't give an explanation in naturalistic terms of consciousness because you've kind of set up the problem that way already. So as an alternative to that, there are those in the naturalistic tradition who endorse what are sometimes called higher order theories of consciousness. And probably most famously, John Locke had such a theory of consciousness. So for Locke, his view was that when we talk about consciousness, what we're talking about is whether or not a state is conscious or not, a mental state. And those mental states are conscious when we perceive those states, so that when we are aware of ourselves as being in those states. And this is what's known as the higher order perception theory of consciousness, and it's probably one of the more intuitive ways of thinking about higher order theories, but it's not the only way of doing it. And so recently, David Rosenthal has advanced what he calls the higher order thought theory of consciousness. And instead of postulating a perception of our own mental states, what Rosenthal thinks is that conscious states are the ones which we are aware of ourselves as being in, and the appropriate awareness takes the form of an esoteric, non-inferential thought to the effect that we are in such a state. So what I'm going to be doing in this talk is basically taking David Rosenthal's theory for granted. So I'm not going to be arguing that it's wrong. I'm not going to be arguing that it's right. I'm not really interested in defending the theory. What I'm interested in doing is presenting a puzzle for the theory. So, and the puzzle really is generated from, so to speak, within the theory. So it's once you get to understand the theory, then the puzzle presents itself. So I'm going to first lay out the basics of the higher order thought theory. And then once we have the basics there, we'll be able to see what is so puzzling about this view. So let's go ahead and get started. So these are some the basics of the higher order theory. So we postulate first order states. And a first order state is simply a state which is a mental state about something in the world. So here I am thinking that philosophy is cool, and this is an unconscious thought according to the theory, or in other words, it's a thought that I have, but I'm not aware of myself as having it. Now when I come to be aware of myself as having it, there's a distinct, separate, higher order thought, a thought about the first order thought, namely to the effect that I believe, or think that I believe, that philosophy is cool. So at that point now my thought becomes a conscious mental thought. I'm aware of myself as having that thought. Also, the same story is given in the case of sensations like pain. So we postulate a family of properties, pain star, and the starred properties are just a way of saying that they're not the things in the world, but the things in the mind. So these properties are the first order pains, and they can occur unconsciously as well as consciously. So this, for instance, what I have depicted here is an unconscious pain, a pain that I am not aware of myself as having. When I have the appropriate higher order thoughts, according to this theory, it then becomes, I become aware of myself as having that pain, and the pain becomes conscious. So that's a very rough sketch of the basics of the higher order view. These states, all states can occur consciously or unconsciously, and the difference between them is whether or not they have a higher order thought which targets them. So the puzzle then is generated as follows. When we think about qualitative states like pains, when a pain is conscious, there is something that it's like for me to have that pain. It's something that it's like in the sense of Thomas Nagel's famous use of that phrase, namely that it's for me painful to have the pain. But in the case of thoughts, according to Rosenthal, there is nothing that it's like to have a conscious thought. And the basic puzzle that I want to present is, if one takes the higher order thought theory seriously and really gets into the nuts and bolts of it and understands how the theory is supposed to explain the phenomenal consciousness arising, well, then it just becomes mysterious why we have this asymmetry here. So if the higher order thoughts can account for the phenomenal aspect of pains, then they ought to do the very same thing with respect to thoughts. And sometimes, so I can formalize this argument a bit, and sometimes I call it, to have a name for the argument, hot implies Pam. It sort of rhymes with ought implies can, but it's not important. And basically what that says is higher order theories imply a phenomenal aspect for all mental states. So that's basically the thesis that I'm going to be arguing for today, and namely that if higher order theories are able to account for phenomenal consciousness, then they must also postulate phenomenal aspects to thoughts. So here's how the argument goes. First premise states that the higher order state is responsible for the existence of there being something that it's like to have the first order state in the first place. And more specifically, it's the content of the higher order thoughts which determines the exact way that it is for me to have the state. So if those two things are true, then it follows that, or I'll argue, it follows that when I have a conscious belief, it should be like believing that P for me. There should be something that it's like for me, and it should be the way that the content of the higher order thought specifies that it's like for me. Now, if one denies this, I claim, then one has in effect admitted that there is something special about qualitative properties, or qualitative concepts. And if one does that, one has in effect given up on the higher order theory of consciousness, and those who think that consciousness can't be explained in naturalistic terms win. So there's Dave Chalmers looking very pleased that he wins in this case. So before I begin, though, I want to say just a couple of things about cognitive phenomenology, because this is a topic that has independently become an issue in the philosophical literature. So there are lots of philosophers who argue that thoughts have a phenomenal aspect. So there's Alvin Goldman there, who has famously argued for this case. There's Galen Strawson, a former professor of mine at the Graduate Center, who also thinks that thoughts have a phenomenal aspect. Charles Seward, in his book, The Significance of Consciousness, he was a student of Searle at Berkeley. He also has recently argued that thoughts have phenomenal aspects to them. And then finally, there's David Pitt, who is also a Graduate Center alum now at California State University, Los Angeles. He has a paper in philosophy and phenomenological research where, called What Is It Like to Think That P?, where he also argues that thoughts have a phenomenal aspect to them. So now, given that there's this interest in phenomenology of thought, one might wonder, well, what is the project I'm engaging in here? Is it the case that I'm saying higher order theories should be expanded to include phenomenal aspects of thoughts, given that we already believe that there is such an aspect to thought? No, that's not what I'm arguing. I'm arguing for something stronger. I think that it's clear from the way the theory is set up that if there is a phenomenology to thought, higher order theories can sort of just be expanded to include that aspect of our mental life. But what I'm trying to suggest is that if they don't, if in fact they deny that thoughts have this phenomenal aspect, then they have defeated the higher order theory in its most interesting form, namely the form that is trying to explain how phenomenal consciousness arises in the naturalistic world without any mysteries. So what I'm going to do now is go through each one of those premises of the argument, suggesting why they're true from the work of Rosenthal, and then trying to put this argument together in a more careful way. So I'll start with the role that the higher order thought itself plays, according to David. So here's a quote from Rosenthal's book, Consciousness and Mind, which came out in 2005, which I take to be his considered view on these matters. It's a collection of papers that he's been writing over the last 20 years. They've been significantly updated and revamped, and so again, I take this to be his considered view. So here's a quote for him where he says, "There is something that it is like for one to be in a qualitative state when one is conscious of oneself as being in that state. And conversely, there is nothing that it is like for one to be in a qualitative state that isn't conscious. So this seems to me to be pretty clear evidence that it's the higher order thought which accounts for the existence of phenomenology on Rosenthal's view. So just to give you a quick illustration of that, here I am in pain, for instance. Someone has dropped an anvil on my foot in this picture. Actually, I'm playing the drum, but it looks like I'm in pain there, so I figured I'd use this picture. But here I have a pain star quality, so there is a pain that I have. But since it's not a conscious pain, Rosenthal claims that there is nothing that it is like for me to have that pain. From my point of view, it's as though I didn't have the pain. If someone asked me, are you in pain, I would deny it. If someone says, does it hurt, I would say no. And that's because I'm in no way aware of the pain as being there. And now that's a bit of a controversial view, and I'm not trying to argue for that here. I'm merely pointing out that this is, in fact, David Rosenthal's view. And this is part of the thing that causes the problem. Now, when that pain becomes conscious, namely when I have a higher order thought to the effect that I'm in that pain, suddenly, now it's painful for me. Now what it's like for me is like having a pain. So the higher order thought determines whether or not there is anything that it is like for the person to have these mental states. And in fact, Rosenthal has been very clear over the course of his writing that even in the absence of the first order state, so in cases where you only have the higher order thought and no first order state, in those cases, it's still the case that what it's like for you is like having a pain. So in this case here, where there's no first order state at all, Rosenthal has consistently maintained that nonetheless one is having a conscious pain. And that from one's point of view, there is no difference phenomenologically between this case and the previous case where the first order state was there. Now, there will be differences from the third person point of view. So, for instance, if the pain is allegedly occurring in one's foot, one won't be limping if the first order state is there, even though from one's point of view it will seem as though one's foot is in pain. And so here's a quote from David where he just says the thing that I was saying. So he says, since there can be something that it's like for one to be in a state with particular mental qualities, even if no such state occurs, a mental state's being conscious is not strictly a relational property. A state's being conscious consists in its being a state one is conscious of oneself as being in. So oftentimes people mistakenly think that Rosenthal's view is a relational view, that there's some relation between the higher order thought and the first order state, which then results in the first order states becoming conscious. But in fact, his actual view isn't that. The first order state doesn't even need to be there for there to be something that it's like for one to have these states. And so being conscious for a mental state isn't a relation between the first order state and the higher order state. What it is just having the appropriate higher order thought. So I take this as conclusive evidence that on Rosenthal's view, it's the higher order thought which is doing all the work. The first order state has no role to play in determining whether or not there's something that it's like for one to have that state when it's conscious. So now what I want to turn to is talking about the second premise of the argument, namely the premise that talks about the content of the higher order thought. So again, here's another quote from David. He says, what it's like for us to be in a specific qualitative state is determined by the way consciousness represents that state, by the content of the higher order thought. So the particular qualitative aspect of one's conscious experience is completely and exhaustively determined by the content of the higher order thought. So here's another illustration of that, again, from Consciousness in Mind. He says, suppose that I am in pain. Suppose that the pain is conscious. But suppose that I am not aware of whether the pain is throbbing or dull or sharp. Because the pain is conscious, there is something that it's like to be in it. Suppose now there is some physiological third-person reason to think that the pain is throbbing as opposed to dull. Well, if that's the case, what it's like to be in the pain leaves out one of its qualitative properties, that of being a throbbing pain. So the idea here is this, again, just to illustrate it. Suppose that I have a throbbing pain star quality in my experience. There's a there's a way to determine whether or not that is the case. Say, for instance, we learn enough neuroscience that we're able to type these kinds of things from a third-person point of view. Well, when I have my higher order state, and the higher order state just represents the first order state as a pain, but not as a particular kind of pain, well, then what it's like for me is just like being in some generic pain. It's not like being in a throbbing pain from my point of view, according to the theory. What it's like for me is just being in some nondescript pain. So even when there's a mismatch between the content of the higher order state and the first order state, it's the particular content of the higher order thought which determines what it's like for me. Here again, Rosenthal is making this kind of claim. And if qualitative states can occur without one's being conscious of all their mental qualities, what reason can we give to deny that such states can occur without our being aware of any of those qualities? So the basic idea here is from these kind of common sense cases, and the pain throbbing case is supposed to be a generalization of a common sense kind of case. Well, I mean, we often will have experiences that are more fine-grained than our conscious experience lets us onto. So if you're looking at some determinate shade of red, but you are merely aware of it as being some red or other, what it's like for you to have that experience is just like seeing red. Even though we could do some psychophysics on you and determine what specific first order shade of red is being represented. So these two things come apart. It's the higher order thought and the content of the higher order thought which are doing all the work in this case. So now I think that we're in a position where we can see the problem. So I like to introduce, to dramatize the problem by thinking about a person that I call Jerry. Jerry is a sort of Mary-like kind of case, and so Jerry's going to be played in my talk by Jerry, the most famous Jerry that I know of. So here's Jerry. Suppose that Jerry has never had a conscious thought. He's had lots of thoughts, but suppose we've interfered with Jerry's brain in some way to prevent all of the conscious making higher order thoughts from coming into existence. So he never is aware of himself as being in these states. He's only having these first order states. So Jerry's gone his whole life never having a conscious thought, but he has plenty of thoughts. Now suppose that suddenly we unblock his conscious thoughts so that he has his very first higher order thought. Poof, it comes into existence. I believe that P suddenly. Now, according to the view under consideration, the thought becomes conscious at that moment. So Jerry has his very first conscious thought. But, according to the view, there is no difference in what it's like to be Jerry from the moment before he had his first higher order thought to the moment after that first higher order thought occurs. Jerry is a zombie before the thought occurs. There's nothing that it's like for him. He's a zombie afterwards. There's still nothing that it's like for him, even though now he has a conscious mental state. Well, that to me seems very bizarre, especially when one thinks about the pain case. When the pain occurs unconsciously, the two states are on a par. When the pain is there, there's nothing that it's like for Jerry to have the pain. As far as Jerry is concerned, he's a zombie. He has no feeling of pain whatsoever. When Jerry comes to have the higher order thought, suddenly, pain phenomenology in all of its glory, or in glory, depending on how you feel about pain, the things that we all know and love from our introspective feats of mental access come into existence. Why should it be the case that phenomenology comes into existence in the pain case, but it doesn't come into existence in the thought case? So now this isn't a general question about why do pains have phenomenology. This is a question about the higher order thought theory and what in the theory allows us to make this kind of distinction. There is no difference between these two thoughts. They both occur in the same way, unmediated by inference, seemingly unmediated by inference from the first person. They both simply apply concepts to the first order states. In one case, it's a qualitative concept or a phenomenal concept. In the other, it's not. But why should that make such a difference? Now, typically when I make this kind of argument, and I've presented this argument enough times now to know that there's basically one line of response that people settle on. And so here's the response, and this is going to bring out, I think, what's really wrong with the view. So many people have said this to me. They say, look, qualitative states have qualitative properties. So, of course, when you're conscious of those kind of states, because they're qualitative, don't you know, then naturally there's something that it's like for us to have them. But thoughts don't have any qualitative properties. So there's a difference. There's a difference in the kind of properties that we become aware of. And that explains why in one case there's something that it's like for us to have these states, and in the other case that it isn't. But this response just makes the problem even more pressing and mysterious. So remember Jerry. Here's Jerry. He has a pain. The pain becomes conscious. What we're being told is that when you're conscious of a pain, those pains have qualitative properties, and so therefore there's something that it's like for you to have those states. Well, one way of reading that is as hearing it to say, oh, there's something very special and interesting about qualitative properties. You see, they're special. They have this interesting property of being phenomenal. And when we're conscious of that, then we're aware of the phenomenal properties, and that makes us have this conscious phenomenology. But if one thinks that, it's pretty clear that one's given up on the higher order thought theory in its most interesting form, because it's part and parcel of the higher order theory that first order states have no phenomenality or phenomenology to them. Here's why. If they did, then you haven't explained phenomenal consciousness in terms of higher order thoughts. What you've explained is how we have access to phenomenal consciousness. But phenomenal consciousness is still as mysterious as ever because it's something that these starred properties have. And those starred properties are very different than the ordinary concepts that we employ in our day-to-day life. But that defeats everything that we were told we were going to get at the end of this excursion, namely a satisfying naturalistic explanation for why phenomenal consciousness exists and how it isn't mysterious. Now, on the other hand, one might think, aha, you see, it's the concepts that we apply, right? So, sure, it's not the first order starred properties that are interesting and special. There's something interesting and special about the concepts that we apply in the higher order thoughts about those qualitative states. So it's not pain star that's interesting, it's the concept of pain star that's interesting and that does the work. But this, I claim, further just compounds the mystery, because pain star, according to Rosenthal, is just an ordinary concept. It's a concept which is acquired by noticing that there is a difference between the way things appear to you and the way things really are. So according to the theory, you get these concepts simply by becoming tuned in to the kinds of errors that happen in perception. And this is the kind of thing that animals can engage in. Squirrels, for instance, can have these kinds of concepts. A squirrel might be looking over there and notice that, oh, gee, that thing looked like it was bent, but it really isn't. There you go, you have the starred quality. So they're nothing special. They're just concepts which are acquired from attending to our first order experiences and the way they misrepresent things occasionally. So they're really no different than the kinds of concepts that we employ when we talk about beliefs. Right? There's concepts we get from the first order state. So where's the specialness in there? There don't seem to be anything that one can appeal to and say, well, this is the reason why they're special. Any kind of claim for specialness results in one becoming further and further confused why it should be the case that thoughts aren't special like that in the same way. And if you can't explain this asymmetry, then we don't have an account of phenomenal consciousness that isn't mysterious. Because it's still a big mystery here. It's only when you have thoughts about qualitative states that you get phenomenology. Well, why doesn't the very same kind of thought, in the case of first order beliefs, make it the case that what it's like for me is believing that P? So it just seems to me that there's no satisfying answer that one can give from within the higher order theory. Rather, what it seems like is going on is that David Rosenthal has an antecedent belief that thoughts don't have qualitative character, and so he builds that into his theory. But there's no justification for that build-in that comes from the theory itself, and so what we have is this very perplexing, mysterious asymmetry between the two kinds of states. Okay, so with that, I'll open the floor to questions or comments. Thank you very much.